What if your daily job was flying thousands of gallons of gasoline through hurricane-force winds, over the tallest mountains on Earth, in a plane that could explode at any moment? This was reality for thousands of Allied pilots in World War II. One of them was a young American named Lieutenant Frank D. Martin. His story, long hidden in private letters, reveals one of the most dangerous and least known operations of the entire war. The Hump Airlift. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan swept across the Pacific, capturing islands and nations at an astonishing pace. When the Japanese seized Burma in 1942, they cut off the Burma Road, the only supply route carrying Allied aid into China. Without those supplies, the Chinese front would collapse, and there would be no bases for American bombers to reach Japan. The Allies faced an impossible problem: how to keep China in the fight. The answer began in the remote jungles of India, where tens of thousands of soldiers and native laborers hacked a new road out of the mountains. It was called the Lado Road, a 800-mile chain of mud, cliffs, and jungle that Winston Churchill dismissed as, quote, an immense, laborious task, unlikely to be completed until the need for it has passed. He was nearly right. By the time the road opened, the war was already turning. But before that, it became clear that trucks could never deliver enough fuel or ammunition across such terrain. The only way to keep China supplied was by air directly over the Himalayas, through storms no pilot had ever dared to face year-round. They called the route the Hump. It stretched from India's Assam Valley, across Burma's jagged ridges, to China's inland bases. At its highest point, the route climbed more than 20,000 feet above sea level. Pilots flew into swirling clouds, without radar, over mountains that rose higher than their aircraft could climb. Winds reached 250 miles per hour. Downdrafts could drop a plane 3,000 feet in seconds. Ice built up on wings faster than it could be scraped away. Visibility often vanished completely, and the cargo holds were filled with fuel, thousands of gallons of it turning every plane into a flying bomb. It was, quite literally, the most dangerous airlift in history. More than 600 aircraft and 1,300 airmen were lost. For every 500 tons of cargo delivered, one crew member never came home. The mountains below glittered with wreckage. Pilots grimly called the route the Aluminum Trail. Into this storm flew Frank Martin. He had trained as a transport pilot and was ordered to deliver a twin-engine C-47 from Delaware to India. The trip alone took 22 days and more than 95 hours of flight time across the Atlantic, North Africa, and the Arabian Desert before reaching a primitive airstrip carved from the jungle. His job was simple. On paper, fly gasoline, bombs, and troops from India into China, and bring back whatever needed transport, but the planes he flew were far from safe. Frank's main aircraft was the C-87 Liberator Express, a hastily converted B-24 bomber with the guns removed and a cargo floor welded through the old bomb bay. It was never meant to haul freight. The controls were awkward, the hydraulics leaked constantly, and the electrical system failed without warning. Another version, the C-109, carried almost 6,000 gallons of fuel. It burned 3 gallons just to deliver one. Crews called it a flying gas can. On one flight, a fuel drum burst open, soaking the cockpit floor in gasoline. One spark, one loose wire, could have turned the plane into a fireball. Frank and his co-pilot shut down every switch they could and flew on in silence, terrified even to use the radio. Miraculously, they made it back. His logbook noted the event only with 5 dry words: returned with leaky gastrum, and us were not so lucky. At Tespa Air Base, tankers crashed almost weekly, sometimes during takeoff, sometimes vanishing into storms. Flames lit the jungle skies. Rescue was impossible. Pilots gave blood to survivors, then watched them die hours later, in letters home to his wife, Sarah. Frank wrote little about death. Instead, he wrote about life, the villagers who gave him coconuts, the barefoot children who waved at his bicycle, and his house servant Abdul, who loved opera and cried when Frank gave him a gold watch before leaving India. Those letters, 211 in total, were hidden away for 50 years, until Sarah's final years, when they were discovered in a drawer. Together they form a portrait of a man trying to stay human in an inhuman war. He described the exhaustion of endless missions, 10-hour flights across the hump, landing, unloading, and taking off again before dawn. Once, in a single 24-hour period, he logged 22 hours of flight time to full round trips over the mountains with almost no rest. He wrote, "I am so tired and dopey that I really don't know what I am doing half the time. It gets dark over that 1,000 miles of stone until the storms light it up like day. We were flying among stars above the storm." That line would later inspire the title of a book about his life among stars above the storm. As the months dragged on, the danger became routine. One night he narrowly avoided a head-on collision with another tanker taxiing in the fog. His plane, heavy with gasoline, barely lifted off in time. The landing gear struck the other aircraft's tail and bent the wheel. He still flew on to China because, as he wrote, our duty was to deliver the fuel. Sometimes his passengers were Chinese nationalist soldiers, many sick, barefoot, and starving. On one flight, several froze to death mid-air. He wondered if their families ever learned what happened. Yet, in the middle of this horror, he found unexpected peace among the people of Assam. Between missions, he rode through the jungle to visit families who shared what little they had: fruit, tea, laughter. He wrote that he had seen more goodness in the poorest homes than in any officers' club. Still, tragedy never stopped knocking. Friends crashed and burned almost weekly. Each letter home carried another name lost. "I need a good cry tonight," he wrote, "but I just can't. One of our best men was killed last night. His ship crashed and burned right after takeoff." He was weary of it all. "It isn't the hump that's dangerous," he told Sarah, "but the rushing and the assigning of unqualified people. It sure makes you sick." By late 1944, he had completed 66 crossings of the hump. Tokyo Rose, the infamous Japanese radio propagandist, warned Allied pilots that none who flew the route would ever return. Frank laughed in his letters but admitted, "Now you'd better start worrying about me." On his final missions, he ferried fuel to bases that launched the new B-29 Superfortress bombers striking Japan. For every ton of bombs dropped on Tokyo, 18 tons of supplies had to be flown over the hump. The effort cost thousands of lives, but it kept the air war alive. On Christmas Day 1944, Frank flew his last trip over the mountains. As he landed back in Tezpur, enemy alerts still blared. He shut down the engines, climbed out of the cockpit, and walked away for the last time. He had survived. Many of his friends had not. For his service, he received the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal, though he rarely spoke of them again. After the war, he returned home, became an executive at Cessna Aircraft Company, and raised a family. Like many veterans, he almost never talked about what he'd seen. His letters and photographs, black and white snapshots of jungles, temples, and smiling children, remained hidden until decades later. Only then did his son uncover them. Along with Sarah's careful bundles of correspondence, reading them was like opening a time capsule. The daily fear, the humor, the longing, and the quiet decency of men doing an impossible job. Frank had once written, Who knows, maybe someday these letters will become a diary of all this. And now, they have, the Hump Operation, delivered more than 650,000 tons of supplies, bombs, food, and medicine across the Himalayas. It was the longest supply line of the war, stretching 12,000 miles from American factories to Chinese airfields. It kept China in the fight and helped shorten the war against Japan. But its human cost was immense. Entire crews vanished into the clouds, their names etched only on memorials. To this day, explorers still find wrecks hidden in the mountain's silent, aluminum ghosts of the men who never came home. Frank D. Martin's letters remind us that behind every statistic, there was a human story, a husband writing to his wife from a bamboo hut, dreaming of peace while the engines roared outside. He ended one of his last letters with these words: "If we live our lives properly, I feel confident we will find the peace and happiness that so often seems to have vanished from the earth." That was New Year's Eve, 1944. A few weeks later, he began his long flight home from Karachi to Cairo, Casablanca, the Azores, and finally Delaware. He arrived on January 28, 1945. He never flew the hump again. But because of men like him, the war in Asia could finally end. The next time you see a small aluminum photograph of a transport plane or a faded letter from the 1940s, remember the courage it took to climb into one of those aircraft loaded with fuel, heading into storms, flying among stars above the storm. These were the forgotten heroes of World War II. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more people discover the forgotten history of World War II. And if you want to see more human stories like this one, watch the playlist World War II Untold Stories right here. Thank you for watching.